The courtroom was dead silent, not even the hum of an AC unit could be heard. The prosecutor reached into a worn leather folder and pulled out a USB drive. "What you're about to hear," he warned, "is not for the faint of heart." Seconds after the recording began, the courtroom filled with gasps, dry heaves, and then chaos. One juror stumbled out, hand over mouth. Another collapsed, pale as a ghost. The judge slammed her gavel, but the horror had already clawed its way into everyone's minds. What they heard was not just evidence, it was a descent into madness. Lily Moran had always been a creature of habit. Coffee at the same corner cafe every morning, class by 9, a call to her mother every Thursday night without fail. So when she failed to show up for work one morning and didn't answer any calls, alarm bells started ringing almost immediately. Her roommates, puzzled but not yet panicked, waited until nightfall before calling the police. The officers arrived, found no signs of forced entry or struggle, and suggested that maybe Lily had just taken off for a while. But those who knew her knew better. Lily wasn't the type to disappear. Days turned into weeks. Posters littered the city, her smiling face slowly becoming another ghost in the crowd. A few tips trickled in, none of them useful. One person swore they saw her at a bus stop in Ohio. Another claimed she'd been hitchhiking through Nevada. Nothing panned out. The case grew colder with every false lead. Her family held candlelight vigils, clung to hope. Her mother kept her room exactly as it had been, sheets unwashed, light left on at night. But as seasons changed, that hope began to rot into grief. It was almost 9 months later, during a routine patrol in a sleepy residential neighborhood, that something shifted. Officers responded to a noise complaint, repeated low-frequency sounds coming from a property on the edge of town. The neighbor, a retired librarian, told police she'd been hearing the same eerie sound every night at exactly 2:33 a.m. It wasn't music, she said. It wasn't machinery either. It was something else. Something wrong. Police arrived at the house, an aging 2-story property hidden behind overgrown hedges. The curtains were always drawn, the yard a graveyard of rusted tools and broken furniture. The man who answered the door was pale, tall, and oddly emotionless. He introduced himself as Alan Kreel. No criminal record. No active employment. No family in town. The officers were polite, asked a few questions and prepared to leave, until they noticed something strange. The air coming from inside the house smelled of iron and damp stone, like an old basement full of secrets. They asked to step inside. Kreel hesitated for a fraction too long. That was enough. One officer went around the back while the other stayed with Kreel, whose eyes tracked them like a predator trying not to blink. Inside, the house was dim and uncomfortably silent. Every surface was spotless, eerily so. But the silence was occasionally broken by what sounded like a hum, low and rhythmic, as if the house itself was breathing. The officers split up. One checked the kitchen, the other walked down the hall and found a door that led to the basement. It was in the basement that things shifted from strange to nightmarish. Behind a shelf bolted to the wall, they found something peculiar, scrape marks on the concrete floor and faint impressions on the wall behind it. With effort, they pushed the shelf aside and discovered a narrow, hidden doorway. Beyond it, a steep staircase descended into darkness. The hidden room was small and windowless, soundproofed from the inside out with layers of foam drywall and lead sheeting. A single chair sat in the middle of the room, bolted to the floor. Duct tape and leather straps were affixed to the armrests and legs. On one side of the room, a table with audio recording equipment and surgical tools. The other side held shelves stacked with dozens of labeled USB drives. But the most disturbing detail was the wall in front of the chair. It was covered in photos. Photos of Lily. Her eating, walking to school, reading in the park. They weren't photos anyone else could have taken. They were from high angles, close distances. Many of them appeared to be taken from inside her own apartment. Someone had been watching her for months before she disappeared. Her entire life had been documented and studied. She had been chosen. The police arrested Kreel immediately, though he offered no resistance and said nothing. Not a word. Back at the station, as investigators combed through his hard drives and physical evidence, they found references to at least 3 other missing persons cases. But it was Lily's that provided the most damning connection. On one USB drive, marked simply Subject Elm Session 6, they found an audio file that would later become the most infamous piece of courtroom evidence in years. But at that moment, the discovery of the hidden room was enough. They informed Lily's family that her remains had been identified, buried shallowly in the woods behind the house, covered in plastic and lime. The news destroyed her mother. Her father, who had refused to accept her death, collapsed at the morgue upon seeing the confirmation. The town mourned but also braced itself, because there was more to come. Kreel hadn't just taken lives. He had documented them, recorded them, rehearsed them. And it was clear now that Lily wasn't his only victim, just the last one before he slipped up. The vanishing of Lily Moran, once a footnote in cold case files, had become the catalyst for unraveling something far darker. And though the media focused on Kreel's sickening crimes, it was that one routine noise complaint that ultimately opened the door to the truth. Alan Kreel was the kind of man who could live in your neighborhood for a decade and never make it into a single conversation. He paid his bills on time, didn't cause trouble, and rarely left his home. Some neighbors had only seen him twice. Others weren't even sure he existed. He had no visible family, no friends, and no visitors. His windows were always shuttered, the mailbox never overflowing, the lights inside dim and sporadic. A recluse by every definition, but not the harmless kind. When police began investigating him, they quickly realized how little the world knew about Alan Kreel. He had no social media accounts, no criminal history, no school records past age 16. There was no employment trail, no taxes filed in the last 5 years. He was a ghost in the system. The only concrete pieces of identification, his driver's license and an expired passport, both had outdated addresses and almost no digital footprint. It was as if he'd deliberately erased himself. But behind that curtain of nothingness, investigators found a life meticulously constructed to stay hidden. His home was not just a dwelling, it was a fortress designed for isolation and secrecy. Cameras were installed but not outward-facing. They were pointed inside, capturing movements in every room, wired to an internal server system without internet access. His bedroom was Spartan, with a mattress on the floor and no personal decorations. The kitchen had food but no warmth. It wasn't a home, it was a containment unit. And at the center of it all was that hidden room, the one carved behind walls, shielded from sound and built to observe pain. The journals were the first clue to how far Alan's obsession with control had gone. Dozens of them, stacked neatly in chronological order, filled with diagrams, dates, schedules, and personal reflections that bordered on scientific detachment. Each entry logged not just actions but reactions, how long it took a subject to cry, to scream, to go silent. He wrote about pain as if it were data, about fear as though it were an equation. His tone was never emotional. It was analytical, calculated, cold. In one journal, investigators found entries about Lily, months before she ever disappeared. Her name never appeared directly, but the descriptions matched her routine perfectly. Subject passes bus stop at 7:43 a.m., or, subject hesitated at mailbox today. Disruption? Unlikely. Possible early paranoia. It was clear that Lily had been stalked, studied, and selected. Not randomly, not impulsively, but methodically. And yet, the most horrifying discovery wasn't on paper. It was in the digital files. Among the USB drives was one marked Final Session. This drive, later played in court, contained the audio recording that made jurors physically ill. But before that moment, investigators listened to it in a dim-lit evidence room, headphones clamped over their ears. What they heard was unlike any torture recording they'd encountered. The audio didn't begin with screams. It began with silence, followed by a calm male voice, Kreel's voice, speaking in a tone one might use in a medical training video. He described what the subject was feeling, what stage of psychological break they were approaching. Every so often, the voice would pause and faint sobbing could be heard, muffled, distant, but unmistakably real. Then came the noises. Not screaming exactly, but whimpering, mechanical sounds, metal scraping, a ticking metronome, a chime, and what sounded like whispered counting in reverse. There were no images, no video, just sound. But it was enough. Enough to make seasoned detectives pull off their headphones and leave the room to vomit. Enough to require mental health leave for 2 audio technicians. And when Kreel was finally confronted about it, he gave no explanation. He simply said, "That was the last piece I needed." The phrase confused everyone. Last piece of what? A ritual? A pattern? A plan? Investigators never got a clear answer. But as they dug deeper, they found more chilling evidence that Kreel viewed his actions as part of some broader structure. Something he was building layer by layer. Each victim was a session. Each session had audio, data, reactions, and results. It wasn't about killing. It was about breaking. About recording the break. Neighbors were horrified. Interviews with them revealed that Kreel was always quiet, always kept to himself, but there had been signs. One local dog walker recalled hearing what she thought was a radio late at night, but when she paused to listen, it sounded more like chanting. Another neighbor mentioned that her cat had gone missing, and when she asked Kreel, he just stared at her and said, "Animals return to the place of pain." The investigation into Kreel's background revealed a childhood marked by instability and foster care, but nothing that pointed to the monster he had become. There were no warnings, no outbursts, no obvious signs of psychosis. He was invisible. That's what made him so dangerous. He could walk among society without leaving a footprint. And yet, inside his head, he was constructing a symphony of suffering, one he documented with surgical precision. Alan Kreel didn't want attention. He didn't want fame or credit. He wanted control, absolute, unflinching control over another human soul. And once he had it, he didn't kill out of rage or passion. He ended lives as if closing a file. Quietly. Finally. He lived in the shadows because the shadows gave him freedom. In the absence of identity, he created one. One built not on who he was but on what he could take away from others. And with every victim, he came closer to perfecting the one thing he valued most: silence. The courtroom was packed that morning, reporters with notepads ready, the victim's family seated stiffly in the gallery, and the jury arranged like statues carved from nerves. The air felt dense, as if charged with something unspoken. Everyone had read the headlines. Everyone had heard about the hidden room, the journals, the missing women. But no one, not even the most hardened detectives, were ready for what was about to be played. The prosecution had debated whether to present the audio recording at all. Legal advisors had warned it could be considered prejudicial, traumatizing, even unethical. But ultimately, it was decided that the jury had to hear the truth, not just the facts but the reality. What Alan Kreel had done could not be captured in photos or paperwork. It had to be heard, experienced, felt. The judge, seasoned and stern, gave a solemn warning before the audio was played. You are about to hear material that is graphic in nature. Any juror who feels unable to proceed may be excused. No one moved. They were frozen in anticipation, unsure of what they were walking into. Then the prosecutor inserted the USB drive marked "Final Session." The speakers crackled lightly, then silence. Then came the voice. It was calm, steady, void of emotion. Alan Kreel's voice filled the room like a fog. Subject is aware. Resistance has decreased. Breathing elevated. Subject is at 16% emotional collapse. Then came a faint, stifled sob. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just broken. Real. The voice continued, "We are initiating the final stage. Begin the rhythm." Suddenly, a metronome began ticking, sharp, clinical beats that grew louder with each passing second. After a few ticks, another sound layered itself beneath, a metallic scrape, like chains dragging on stone. In the background, someone whispered, inaudible at first, then slowly forming words. "Please stop. Please, please, please." A juror gasped. Another covered her mouth with both hands. The audio played on. Kreel's voice never rose in volume or intensity. When stimulus increases, the subject retreats inward. Observe silence. This is where the fear coagulates. Then, without warning, a high-pitched frequency rang through the speakers, shrill, piercing. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of retching. In the courtroom, a juror stood up and staggered out of the box, vomiting into a waste bin near the wall. Another man, an older juror, trembled violently, tears streaming down his face. The judge immediately called for a recess, banging her gavel to stop the playback. But the damage had been done. The courtroom was in disarray, jurors shaken, reporters too stunned to write, the gallery in collective horror. People weren't just disturbed, they were wounded by what they'd heard. When court reconvened hours later, the prosecution petitioned to pause the trial for mental health evaluations of the jury. The defense argued the recording was too prejudicial and called for a mistrial. The judge denied the motion but ruled that the remaining audio would not be played publicly again. Only select experts and legal counsel would be allowed to hear the full file. Despite this, the impact of those few minutes was irreversible. Media outlets dubbed the moment, the trial of silence, referring not only to the disturbing audio but the courtroom's stunned reaction. Experts across the country weighed in, psychologists, criminologists, even musicians. Some said Kreel had weaponized sound in a way that bypassed logic and attacked the nervous system directly. Others compared it to psychological warfare. But no theory could fully explain the visceral effect it had on everyone who heard it. Later analysis of the audio revealed deliberate manipulations, low-frequency tones proven to cause anxiety, whispered gibberish designed to mimic schizophrenic hallucinations, and rhythmic pacing that mirrored a heartbeat under stress. It wasn't just a recording, it was a construction. A sonic weapon. And Kreel had engineered it down to the last second. Theories emerged about the purpose of the recording. Some believed it was Kreel's twisted form of art, his final masterpiece. Others thought it was a confession encoded in sound. But those who had studied his journals knew better. Kreel hadn't made the recording for others. He made it for himself, a culmination of his obsession with fear, control, and the human breaking point. He didn't need people to hear it. He needed to create it. To orchestrate a descent into madness with the same precision as a surgeon performing an operation. The jurors who remained on the case were offered counseling, though many declined to speak about what they'd heard. During deliberation, there was no debate. No uncertainty. Kreel was found guilty on all counts, including 3 murders and multiple charges of unlawful imprisonment, psychological torture, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to life without parole. But what haunted people wasn't just what Kreel did. It was how close he came to vanishing completely. Had the neighbor not reported a strange noise, had the officers not pushed for entry, Kreel would have continued. Quietly. Efficiently. Perhaps forever. Even in prison, Kreel refused to speak. He ate, slept, existed, but never gave interviews, never reacted to news coverage, never expressed remorse or pride. He just existed like a void with a heartbeat. And yet, the memory of that audio never faded. Years later, it was still referenced in criminal psychology courses and forensic training. It became infamous, not just for its content, but for the way it transformed a courtroom into a scene of shared psychological trauma. People expect evidence to be visual, tangible. Blood, fingerprints, video. But what Kreel created was a reminder that the mind is just as fragile as the body, and when broken the right way, it leaves no visible scars, only silence.